Welcome to Let's Talk Polarization podcast. I'm your host, Olivia Chang, a Bay Area student passionate about addressing America's political divide. LTP examines political polarization in America through various lenses: history, social media, the economy, identities, to educate youth, stimulate civil discourse, and increase cross-partisan unity. Our bi-weekly episodes include interviews with expert speakers and discussions between passionate individuals with diverging views seeking common ground. Today, I have the honor of interviewing Dr. Hui Bai, a post-doctoral scholar in the Polarization and Social Change Lab at Stanford University. His research examines demographic shifts, cultural changes, and ideological beliefs through the lenses of psychology and politics. In this episode, Dr. Bai examines three critical questions. How do one's political values and identity affect their support for political candidates? How does the growth of the Muslim population affect political polarization? And does racism and sexism undermine Black and female politicians, or does ideology matter more? Enjoy! Welcome, and thank you so much for being here, Dr. Bai. Can you introduce yourself and how you got into research regarding the intersection between identity and politics?
Yeah, so I'm a Stanford Impact Lab postdoc scholar. I am in Dr. Rob Willer's lab and doing research related to people's attitude on race, politics, and just generally social issues. I got my PhD in University of Minnesota. Before that, I grew up in China and spent my time there all the way until I finished my high school, came to the US, then did my undergrad and PhD, and here I'm at Stanford.
Nice. Can you describe your journey pursuing work and research concerning gender, political campaigns, and polarization?
I grew up in China, and the political process there worked very differently. Most citizens don't have a way to vote. There is some kind of voting mechanism, but that's not something that people nearly talk about or actually be able to participate there. So after I finished my high school, I came to the States, started to take classes in social science, which was not something that a lot of people are keen to back in China. So I started in psychology. I was like, wow, all these things, they can be studied in a scientific way. Like all these things you cannot touch or feel. So that really fascinated me. When I started to dig a little bit deeper in the field of psychology, I was really just like drawn to social psychology, particularly the intergroup or political aspect of the discipline. And I was like, wow, all these things I didn't know existed, like how people think about politics, it matters to the real world, and how people think it can translate into their concrete action in the end, who they vote for, what they do. Do they go on the street to do the protest? And those processes, they eventually change how the world actually is. And all those things, they're just so, well, literally foreign to me because I grew up in a different country. So that's just like that was almost like you go to a different world and see all these new things that you didn't know, and that kind of novelty, that level of surprisingness, just like draw me to it. It's like, wow, like I want to know more. What is really going on here? I want to do research on this. Then to the specific topic of like essentially identity politics, that's something that's particularly interesting to me, partially because I'm an immigrant, I'm a racial minority, I'm minority on a lot of criteria. As a part of the process of learning how things works in the United States, I realized different groups, they can have like their own agenda, their own interests, and they have their own way of making progress in the society. While in China, you kind of have like 95% of the people having the same ethnic background. And these are different processes that I never understood before, and I kind of drawn to me, partially because it's so new, and partially because like a lot of them apply to me. I'm also a gay man, and all those quote unquote non-mainstream identities. Like I didn't realize, as someone who is a minority, there is a way you could really still participate in the public discourse and advocate for your own interest and how I think matters. And similarly, how many other marginalized social group think and do matters, and how majority group think about them, those things matters too.
I completely agree. With regard to your research, when do you believe gender began to intertwine with American politics?
That's a very good question. I still have a lot to learn about American history, particularly the political history aspect. But it seems pretty obvious that a lot of it just started from the very beginning when women don't have the right to vote and to participate the political process, or I mean, even bigger than that, like a civil process. It's not a. I don't think it's a unique thing for the United States. The same challenge faced by women in most of the human society. Beyond that regard, the United States has leading the progress in a lot of ways in the past century or so. As the United States is making progress on the gender issue, I think the way gender play a role also matter in different way in different time frame. In the past, when women couldn't vote, then the way gender matters is like, okay, can women actually vote for someone? Then at some point, when Hillary Clinton was participating in presidential election, or even before that, when more women are trying to run for a political campaign, I think it's less about like the woman as citizen, but a lot of it is about like whether people, the voters, believe that someone can be an effective political leader regardless of their gender. So I think gender matters a lot there. And more recently, from some of my own research, I think the way gender matters in society, a lot of it is started to be less about whether that politician, whether that leader is a woman or a man, but a lot to do with what that political leader think about gender issue, gender inequality.
How does one's gender identity relate to their support of political candidates or parties?
There is a lot of research that shows that there's a gender differences among the voters in terms of who they are voting for. Of course, it probably doesn't surprise you that women are more likely to vote for other women candidates who happen to be the ones who are advocating for women. One thing that I think is really interesting is that sometimes the way we think about social identity, the way they work in politics is kind of surprising and different. In one research, this is what I do traditionally, people think that the political candidates race and gender matter in terms of explaining voters' racial and gender attitude. The rationale is pretty straightforward and simple. In normal daily life, we find that people who have a higher level of prejudice tend to interact with women or racial minority less. They have more a disparaging attitude toward them. And by that extension, more prejudice, they probably will try to undermine women and racial minority, but that's not what I found in a study. What I actually found is that people who tend to have more prejudice, they will support someone who have an egalitarian political agenda. And that will be the case regardless the person's race and gender. There's a lot of way to interpret it. One way I think about it is that people who have a higher level of prejudice who actually effectively hide their prejudice by supporting someone who is a woman or who is racial minority, but someone who is egalitarian, whose policy is hindering the progress toward gender and racial equality. And they can say, okay, I'm supporting someone who is a woman, I'm supporting someone who is a Black person. How can I be racist? But because they're supporting someone who is egalitarian, they're really still maintaining the social status quo in terms of gender and racial hierarchy.
That's an interesting finding. Do you see these trends across specific racial, economic, or gender groups?
Right. In this most recent paper I published, Journal of Personality Social Psychology, I looked at people's attitude on gender issues. I even broke that down by men and women and participant, and turned out it really didn't matter. What you think can override whether the participant themselves are men or women voters. We're getting to the point where we're caring a lot more about what the politician think more than what the politician is doing. And similarly to the participants themselves, what they believe about politics matters a lot more than who they are. In Florida, there has been a growing level of demographic diversity. There are a lot more racial minorities, a lot more Hispanic and Latino citizens. They're participating in the civil process. They're voting, and we're anticipating that they will vote in favor of Democrats. But in the last two election cycles, a lot of them they're actually voting for the Republican Party, ostensibly against their own racial group.
Wow, what an interesting connection. Can you describe some of the methods that you used to reach these results?
People who have a higher score of racism and sexism measure those attitude measure in many different ways. Some are just like, how do you feel about people who are Black? And just ask people to endorse different kind of stereotype on race issue and on gender, pay them the same, that kind of thing. And I use those measurement to predict people's support for individual politicians. In reality, we do have racial minority and women politicians who are against egalitarian agenda, like in the last election cycle. For example, we have Ben Carson, who is a Black man, but who is a conservative. And we also have Carly Fiorina, who is a white woman, but who is also affiliated with running as a Republican platform in many ways, like a more egalitarian platform than their Democrat counterparts. In some other studies, I have people evaluate hypothetical politicians and their race, gender, ideology. They're all manipulated in this experiment just to get a cleaner effect. What I find is that politicians' race and gender, they surprisingly matter very little, essentially none, statistically speaking. But what these politicians think, whether they have an egalitarian or egalitarian platform, that's the one that matters. And whether that person is a man or woman, it doesn't matter. So in some ways, it's kind of surprising and counterintuitive compared to the existing framework where people think that, okay, if this is someone who is racist or sexist, they will just oppose that person. Of course, that will be the case during the daily interaction. We have evidence that people who have a higher score of racism, sexism, if they're a teacher, then they will treat minority student harsher. If it's a doctor, they might treat racial minority patient with a harsher criteria. But politicians, they voice their opinion about how they think about the society, race, gender, all these things. And when that happens, voters do pay attention. And the way they pay attention to that can override the race and gender of that politician. So of course, I want to give a little bit qualifier to what I'm saying. One thing that can often be misinterpreted is I'm saying that, oh, okay, race and gender don't matter anymore. No, that's not what I'm saying. Of course, race and gender matter. They matter in a lot of ways. How people think about race and gender eventually guide them to support different politicians. It has a broader impact in terms of whether we have the gender racial disparity in the political arena. Not saying that political representation not matter by itself, but I think the bigger issue is like whether in the society we're seeing racial minority and women are treated equally. Even though people who are racist and sexist, they are still willing to support who is a minority and a woman politician. In a lot of ways, their level of racism and sexism can still eventually feed into a process where racial minority and women political candidates can make it to the top and become political leaders. Life will be more difficult for racial minority and women generally, and it will be harder for them to make progress in their life. And eventually, become someone who is willing or eligible to run for political office.
Knowing that gender discrimination plays a role in higher government, I'm wondering whether it also contributes to political extremism in the United States.
That's a very good question. It definitely does. We just have seen in a lot of discourse among many far-right extremism group regarding how they talk about gender issue and race issue. At least from some qualitative data, we have also seen that people who can express a very strong view on those issues, and it's precisely the same kind of motivation narrative that they rely on that is propelling some of the more extremist action that we're seeing. And some of which we haven't seen them just like circulating on the internet, some less obvious.
Another area of your research explores political responses to demographic shifts. What are the effects of the growing Muslim population in America on both the Republican and Democratic parties?
Yeah, so in another recent paper I published in the group process and in the group relations, I look at the question of how people perceive the population growth of Muslim people and to what extent that is differed by people's political affiliation. The reason I do that is that in social psychology, there has been a growing amount of research that look at how the macro level social trend, like just a racial demographic shift, can shape people's opinion. And one of the very interesting finding is that if you show white American that the racial minority population is growing in the United States in percentage, then they will be sort of triggered and they will have a cascade of right-wing political shift. They will become more racially biased, they will become more politically conservative, and all because of this perception of a status threat. In this research, I kind of want to take it beyond racial context just in the United States. And the reason for that is beyond this population shift within the United States about different racial groups, a far broader trend if we look at the global population is that like a Muslim population is growing pretty rapidly. And in fact, it is the fastest growing religious population in the world. And during the meantime, the prejudice against the Muslim population, it is one of the most socially acceptable ones, particularly among the political right. I mean, the last president we have so openly disparaged people who are Muslim and implemented a series of policies that directly target the Muslim population, the Muslim ban. And so that's one of the biggest issue in the political prejudice I see. It turns out, of course, kind of similar to the racial demographic shift findings in the past. By default, people don't like it. People don't like it for a variety of reasons. The perceived threats, potential concern of cultural threat, and there's a couple other things. But the main thing is that they're worrying that this growing Muslim population will imply that they will enforce Sharia law. I don't know how to say that word. They will somehow change the American legal system by doing these things. Oh, right, the safety threat perception. There's also a number of people who are worrying that there will be a growing level of terrorist attack, things like that. On that side, it is a little different from the existing studies where the demographic shift induced just status threat perception. But in the case of perception of Muslim population growth, it is really just a very diverse set of concerns that's raising from American population. But guess what? This overall finding is only applicable to people who are on the right side among the Republican participants. And it's not the case from the Democrat side. So there is essentially a divergence eventually might contribute to a political polarization. This is something that can trigger divergent reaction from Republican and Democrats. Then as this population shift continue to unfold, their view on anything related to religious minority, they will just continue to diverge in the future.
I definitely agree. I'd love to explore another facet of your research. When it comes to white identity politics, does a politician's race matter more or their ideology?
And essentially, up to the point when Donald Trump was elected, the idea of white identity politics was not something that was in people's mind. Like identity politics was just thought about something that only racial minorities or gender minorities they will have. People assume that it's just like a fish in the water. You don't see water if you're a fish because it's everywhere. Everyone is white. So it's not assumed to play any effect. Then, of course, we know that it does matter with the narratives and rhetoric from Donald Trump and how he got elected. During the meantime, I want to know exactly how it works. Does it work in a way that, okay, if it is a white person, they automatically support someone else who is white? Or is it like similar to the how racism and sexism attitude function? Do people who have a higher level of white identity support someone whose political agenda is more inegalitarian? So I did a couple of study. Eventually, people kind of don't care about whether that politician is white or not white. A lot of it is really driven by their ideological orientation, whether that person is egalitarian or not. So in a lot of ways, the expression of a white identity politics, it is also pretty symbolic, pretty much driven by what people think. So I wanted to know, okay, so does it work in the same way for everyone? Is there any way we can turn that off? One factor I identify is why Americans their own level of egalitarianism, which is measured by the thing that we call the social dominant orientation, which is more or less stable psychological trait. It can still move around, but it reflects people's general egalitarian belief or the lack of. It turns out the effect of white identity on far-right extremism only occur if people who are not egalitarian. And among people who are egalitarian, no matter how high their white identity concern is, they just don't have any far-right extremism tendency. It just doesn't work that way. So in some way, it kind of suggests to me that if we want to really alleviate this far-right extremism tendency that's driven by the concern for white identity politics, then one way we can do it is to cultivate a greater level of egalitarianism beliefs. That way, perhaps people can still have a healthy level of their own racial identity, but without translating that into the far-right extremist actions.
When do you believe in-group bias and party allegiance overcome individual values, and how?
I actually just published another paper this year on this. Essentially, at what point when people's party allegiance is overriding their underlying values, at what point it is going the other way. People care more about their value and willing to ditch their party affiliation. Before I talk about what I did, it's actually something that's often debated in political psychology. Party affiliation and people's ideological belief, those are a correlated variable. If you look at how they're related at like a 0.8 or something. Half of the variance is there. Conceptually, they are also related. People who are conservative tend to be Republican, liberal, they tend to affiliate with the Democrat Party. So people's ideological belief in terms of conservative or liberal value and their party affiliation in terms of Republican versus the Democrat identity, those things tend to be very related and hard to disentangle. It's not clear exactly which one play a greater role than the other because they're just so correlated. In the traditional way of approaching it, people use a participant's party identity and ideology to predict their evaluation of a candidate. And then they see which coefficient is bigger. Whichever is bigger, then they say, okay, that one is the one that play a bigger role. That kind of approach, we have seen all different kind of results showing up. Sometimes party ID is bigger, sometimes ideology is bigger. And what's really going on here? To really understand this, we really need to look at party ID and ideology from two perspectives. One perspective is exactly what past people have done by looking at them from the perceiver side, the citizen side. But the other thing is that we need to look at them from the target side. So what kind of politician we're evaluating? Whether this particular politician is someone who identifies as the Republican versus Democrat Party, and whether this politician has a very strong liberal versus conservative belief. So in this one recent paper, I uncovered a lot of very nuanced effects that are. The first is that people do care a lot about the ideological similarity. If it match, then it increased my support for that person by a lot. And that's the case regardless of my party affiliation or the target's affiliation. If I see that we have similar political value, then I'm going to support you. That's the most consistent thing. And usually that's the biggest concern. If we're talking about a local context, House of Representative election, it still doesn't matter very much. But when we're looking at the context where the presidential election is happening, then that suddenly jumped to be one of the most prominent predictors. It matters a lot. Like if I'm a Republican, then I will be a lot more likely to support a Republican candidate, regardless of whether that candidate is liberal or conservative. The shorter answer is that ideology and party affiliation, they both matter a lot. They just play a different role when we're looking at national office election, like the presidential seat. And then party affiliation certainly matters a lot more than if it is just a local context.
That's very interesting. It seems that both party and ideological affiliation play a great role. I'd love to end our conversation with action items for youth and adults to better America's political system. What can we do on both individual and national scales to reduce the issues of political polarization and extremism?
That's a very good question. In the lab I'm at right now, they just published this research looking at 20 something interventions that can effectively reduce Americans' political polarization. One thing we should do is just here are just the real evidence that these things work. Like, let's try to implement them in the real world and see if that can be something done in a larger scale beyond the lab. Part of the polarization is driven by the filter bubble, and this is something that's talked about again and again with recent research. When you're interested in the liberal things, you go online, you look for liberal things, and the online algorithm will just keep feeding you the liberal things. And the same thing goes for the conservative thing. Then eventually you just don't see what the other side is saying. So in some way, I think it will be still good for us to get out of our digital comfort zones to see exactly what the other side are saying and how they are thinking about the issue, and to have a little more empathy and perspective taking. That way, even if you don't share the belief, at least you know where they're coming from. You are better able to communicate your political belief to the audience who do not share your political belief.
Thank you for listening to Let's Talk Polarization. I hope you gain new knowledge, whether it be a novel method to combat political extremism or the way that racism and sexism ultimately undermine minority politicians. If you would like to participate in the podcast, we would love to have you. Please contact me at letstalkunite@gmail.com. And find more at Let's Talk Unite on Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook, and my website, letstalkunite.org. Have a great rest of your week.